was the summer of 1814. The United States and Great Britain were embroiled in a second war between one another. This war became forever known as the War of 1812. The related battles were known to have caused major damage on both sides, but with no notable outcome for either power. Yet, the lives of many were significantly altered by the actions of a few. At a time when war ravaged the United States and when African Americans were being enslaved and manipulated into cruel and unjust labor, these same slaves were able to make a difference. Their actions during this time proved to be pivotal in the War of 1812, as well as laying down the foundation for the 13th Amendment. About 40 years after the United States seceded from the British Empire, it once again became entangled in a conflict with its former ruler. There are several reasons to why this war began. For instance, in Europe, Britain and a number of its allies were confronted against Napoleon Bonaparte of France. This fight between the massive powers in Europe caused Britain to create massive sanctions on America to prevent them from meddling or adding any trade to Europe. This act, known as the Embargo Act of 1807, stated, "Be it enacted by the Senate of the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that during the continuance of the act laying an embargo on all ships and vessels in the ports and harbors of the United States." Along with the embargo, British troops searched American merchant ships and outright attacked the USS Chesapeake in 1807. These events caused the current president at the time, James Madison, to declare a second war on Britain. As he declares, "War exists between the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland and the dependencies thereof, and the United States of America and their territories." Throughout this time of war and deep into the past, the enslaving of Africans in America was a common occurrence. While being enslaved, some slaves were able to escape or find a way to manipulate the system and become free. During times of war, slaves were given more options for their freedom. In the War of 1812, these chances for freedom were greatly increased with a potential exit ticket from both the United States and the British. While having different outcomes for joining either side, this choice between two nations proved to create a great amount of tension for slaves seeking refuge of any sort.
Despite being once enslaved by their own country, slaves proved to be very useful for the United States during the war. The foremost example of this is Charles Ball. This man had a very eventful life during this time, and he was able to witness and be present for many important moments of this era. Ball, like his father before him, was born into slavery. Lucky for Charles, his master was merciful and kind. He gave Charles his first set of clothing ever when he was bought alongside his father. As he recalls this event in his personal narrative, "At the time I was sold, I was quite naked, having never any clothes in my life, but my new master had brought with him a child's frock or wrapper, belonging to one of his own children, and after he had purchased me, he dressed me in this garment." Many years later, Charles enlisted into the American Navy at the outbreak of the War of 1812. Though he served as a ground unit as well. Charles continues in his personal narrative, "When we reached Bladensburg and the flotilla men were drawn up in line to work their cannon, armed with their cutlasses, I volunteered to assist in working the cannon that occupied the first place on the left of the Commodore." As PBS explains in the following article, titled "Black Sailors and Soldiers in the War of 1812, when Ball enlisted, African Americans made up at least 15% of the U.S. Naval Corps. Although official U.S. policy at the start of the war forbade the recruitment of black sailors, a chronic shortage of manpower compelled the Navy to accept any able-bodied man. In these two quotes, the cameo of Ball and many other African Americans of the time is conveyed. He would load, aim, relocate, or possibly even fire the cannon. Succeeding the general occupations of African Americans in the Navy are the individual heroes. An example of an African hero is Joseph Savary, a former slave and nationalist during the Haitian Revolution and an American Army officer. He also served as a recruiter, who recruited, in total, over 600 men. These men were divided into two battalions. The first, being unnamed, was composed of former soldiers and veterans from the Haitian Revolution. The other was named the Free Men of Color of the Louisiana Militia. Both consisted of only black enlistees. In a passage from blackpast.org, which stated, "Savary, who single-handedly raised a battalion from among the free Negro immigrants from Santo Domingo. The 2nd Battalion, freemen of color, of the Louisiana Militia, some 256 men, including staff officers, were assembled in New Orleans and introduced into the service of the United States on December 19, 1814. Without this former slave, the Battle of New Orleans may have had a very different outcome. There may have been too few Americans to fend off the British. Black soldiers in Savry's battalion may have acquired the most kills in battle. The morale of American forces may have been boosted. The list is endless. Also, without the help of the battalion, the British may have drawn away from the Treaty of Ghent. This may have led them to fight back, win the war, and once again control America, and possibly all of North America. These battalions of black men, while being small in numbers, helped defend what people know as the most powerful country in the world, and without their pivotal actions in these important battles, the story of America may have never been heard.
While slaves were being used in the American army to fend off the invading opponent, they were also given the opportunity to fight against their former country that enslaved them. As previously mentioned, Charles Ball was given a choice at his time of freedom. While he had the chance to join the U.S. Army, the majority of slaves had very limited choices. As the War of 1812 PBS website explains, for most American slaves, the options were limited to the British Navy. When the British fleet arrived in the Chesapeake Bay in March 1813, entire families of slaves made their way by canoe to the enemy ships. This singular choice for the majority of slaves forced them to become more alone and separated than what they already experienced in the United States. The British had one trick up their sleeves, though. They would offer freedom and farmland in the very lucrative West Indies to any slaves who would come willingly into their hands. They will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's forces or being sent as free settlers to British possessions. Black people deserted from their masters and mistresses and escaped to the British fleet. None of these people were ever regained by their owners, as the British naval officers treated them as free people and placed them on the footing of military deserters. Because of this, many former slaves would feel obligated to get back to the British for their life-changing chance and serve for them during the war.
The war ended, on paper, on December 24, 1814, with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. This signing was brought on by a decisive naval victory by the Americans at Plattsburgh Bay. The American victory at Plattsburgh finally pushed the British back into Canada once and for all. Although this battle seemingly ended the war, it wasn't completely over. The Battle of New Orleans, another critical American victory, occurred after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, once again due to poor methods of communication. Despite all of the blood, sweat, and tears lost from African Americans during the war, not much changed. Most who enlisted and fought did gain their freedom, but were imposed back into slavery because they had little to no money or no property to build a life on. Charles Ball is an exception to this statement. Ball owned a farm himself, as he mentions in his account of his life, and purchased a lot of 12 acres of ground, upon which I erected a small house and became a farmer on my own account.
Ball was one of the luckier African Americans, being able to own a farm and a house of his own. He also married and had 4 children, as it is said in the National Park Service article titled "Wedged Between Slavery and Freedom, African American Equality Deferred. The War of 1812 did not provide greater opportunities or equality for free blacks as they anticipated, nor did it initiate a wave of emancipation for enslaved Americans seeking freedom. Their patriotic efforts had not reshaped white minds about what role they should play in society, and public memories of war largely ignored their contributions."
Sadly, despite all the valiant efforts of African Americans to defend the country in which they were being enslaved, slaves received little to no recognition for their heroism and were reinstated into slavery. While it was unlikely for most African Americans to see continuous freedom in the United States, there was a good possibility for the slaves who fled to the British to continue to have free lives. The PBS article explains, as many as 4,000 to 5,000 fled to British protection and were evacuated to Bermuda, Canada, or Trinidad. These people who fled slavery and fought in battles were given a place to live. More so, these free slaves were given land and money. The British offered the colonial marines farmland in Trinidad in February 1816. Their descendants live in Trinidad still, in freedom, and call themselves the Mauricians. People who fled here lived great lives away from the pain they experienced in the United States.
The War of 1812 brought death and destruction to everyone affected by it. Soldiers and civilians alike were brutally slaughtered in a war which only slightly affected either side. The British did not gain the land they sought, and the United States didn't lose any. In a militaristic scene, their war was not important. However, it still gave freedom to thousands of African slaves. It did not considerably affect the national idea of slavery in the United States, as shown when historian Gerard T. Althoff explains in one of his books, My Best Men, African Americans and the War of 1812. Black volunteers in large numbers stepped forward to defend themselves and their homelands, which paradoxically deprived them of basic freedoms in which they fought. Some Africans did gain their freedom because of this war and were given a sense of freedom to fight for. The role of African Americans in the War of 1812 was to serve for their respective sides, as any soldier would, help to lay a strong foundation for their freedom, and overall pushed themselves even further towards the abolishment of slavery.